Hello and welcome to somewhat an unusual version of the Devil's Advocate. Though an advocate by training, I'm not the devil in this interview because the usual devil is my guest today, the one and only Karan Thapa. Welcome, Karan.
Thank you.
Well, you've interviewed many people in this program. How many guests have you left unhappy at the end of the interview?
I may have annoyed several, but I can promise you that I've never left the room after the interview with someone so unhappy that they wouldn't give another interview again.
Well, your guests always receive a very nice, charming letter from you after the interview, praising them. But that praise comes only after the interview. The environment of the interview is always very different.
Because then I'm doing a professional job, and I would hope that the guests understand it. I hope they would accept two things. One, that there is nothing personal in the line of questioning that I adopt. And secondly, even if at times it feels needlessly persistent, perhaps even aggressive, they would accept that he's simply pursuing a point because he thinks it hasn't been answered, rather than being rude.
Well, I have noticed that you've tried to master over these years a very typical contrarian style of asking questions. You research about the guest, about his positioning or his party's positioning, and wherever you find them vulnerable, you have a clipping ready always to ask a question to him. Is it a part of a process to show him down, or is it to extract the best out of him?
It's not part of a process to show him down. The aim is that if you are asking someone a question on an issue, it's worth persisting with the question till you get an answer. That means that you become insistent. Sometimes you seem aggressive, but all I'm doing is to try and get an answer because I believe that not to get an answer is to insult the audience. There's no point.
Have your guests ever felt that you put words into their mouth?
I may have suggested answers to them, but obviously it's up to them to accept whether the offer that I'm making is one that's acceptable.
But your press statements after the interview at times do suggest that the guest means something else and what appears next day may indicate something quite different.
No, I will contest that because I don't think ever we've released a press release that any guest has contested as wrong.
Well, the guests occasionally complain about your interrupting them, even before they've completed the answers. Now, is that a part of a style, or is it a part of, again, extracting the best out of him?
No, in fact, there's a different reason. We record our interviews for live. So every word that's recorded is transmitted. There is no editing whatsoever. Because they're being recorded for live, if a guest refuses to answer, or worse still, deliberately prevaricates as a way of avoiding, then I interrupt because if I don't, he's simply taking up time at the cost of the interview.
Well, looking back at the hundreds of guests you've interviewed in this program or any other program, do you recollect the best that you've interviewed? Somebody who performed exceedingly well, or a few of them, and who did live up to your aggressive questioning?
3 or 4 guests, and interestingly, they come from all the different parties, are challenging because they are smarter than me, they are quicker than me, they can probably anticipate where the line of questioning is going, and so they have thought out answers in their mind before I've got to the question. And you're one of them. Manishankar Iyer is one of them. L.K. Advani, in the days when he gave interviews, was clearly one of them. Those are the sort of guests who you have to be conscious of, that they can turn the tables on you very quickly because they're thinking as fast as you are.
Well, it's not merely the thought process, is it also the language and the control of the subject, the kind of depth of the subject on which you are likely to question them, that determines how well the guest does?
Language is critical because it's an English language program, and so if someone speaks the language fluently, you can interrupt them more, you can be more assertive, they will be equally fast back with you, therefore it's a more enjoyable exchange. And automatically both people are fluent, it becomes a faster exchange and therefore in a sense a more forceful one.
Guests have occasionally walked out of your program?
Only once. The only guest who ever walked out of a program was in fact Mr. Narendra Modi after 4 minutes.
And knowing your post-interview charm, did you speak to him after the interview?
In fact, when that interview ended, he was very sweet to me and he said to me, he says, "You've broken my heart. I apologize that I've ended this interview, but tomorrow I will ring you and we will be brothers for life." Oh. And he did ring the next day.
But do you expect an interview back from him again once?
I would hope so, because I think he has accepted that there was no malice.
I remember somebody ended your program without reciprocating to your thanks in the program.
Absolutely. It was Jayalalitha ji, I ended the program then by saying, a pleasure talking to you, and she did namaste, rejecting my offered hand, and said, I must say, it wasn't a pleasure talking to you, and she left. But she didn't leave before the interview ended. She left as soon as it was over. She actually stormed off.
But I recollect a few months ago, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee shouting at you when you interrupted him, and he claimed a right to reply, and he did very well extract a right of reply.
He did indeed. In fact, it was an interview which was one of the first that he gave as defense minister, so it was actually more than a few months ago. And I was questioning him about what I was told and what the newspapers had claimed was an out-of-turn wrongful promotion of a major general to a lieutenant general. And it was also reported in the papers that the Army Promotion Board had advised against it. And so I questioned him why he did this. And I even said to him that his predecessor, George Fernandez, had stood against this, so it was very strange that he was pushing it through. He got extremely angry for 10 minutes. He threatened to end the interview, but not only did he not, he carried on for the rest of the 20 minutes, and when it ended and the cameras were off, I apologized for having annoyed him, and he was charming. He said, don't be stupid, that's your job. And he walked out hand in hand.
Any guests that you would have loved to interview and you've not been able to do so?
Oh yes, without doubt. I would love to have interviewed Sonia Gandhi. I've tried frantically many times. She once said to me, and God, this was 8 years ago, I promise I'll give you an interview one day. So whenever I meet her, I say, Mrs. Gandhi, when's one day going to come? And she laughs and she smiles, and one day's never come. And I'd love
But tell me, do you ever get the impression that your aggressive style is misunderstood by many, and therefore many of them would not like to be interviewed by you?
Possibly. But you know, and I think anyone else who's thinking and fair will know, that Karan's aggressive style is actually persistence. That's the word I prefer to aggression. And that there is no prejudice. He's equal with everyone, no matter what party they come from. And secondly, he's researched what he's doing so that there is a clear basis for that questioning. I mean, if you challenge him and say, I never said this, I never said that, I have a superb team of researchers and producers who backed it up for me.
Are you a clippings collector?
I have a great team of producers and researchers who are clippings collectors, and they do a sort of devil's advocate with me before I go to do it with you. So they end up taking me through it, suggesting, what if he says A, what if he says B, what if he says D? And there's a very interesting technique that I'll share with you that goes back to my days at London Weekend Television, when John Burt, who used to head London Weekend before he went to the BBC, devised an interview format where he said that, look, at the end of the day, there are only 4 answers. Yes, no, don't know, can't say. And don't know and can't say have to be collapsible into yes and no. So your first technique is identify the don't knows and can't says and push the guy into making clear that actually it's a yes or a no. Then try and locate him within the horns of a dilemma. Choose guests who are so positioned that their predicament is within the horns of a dilemma, and then push them either to the left or to the right.
Somebody you recollect who's been very difficult to interview?
The most difficult people to interview are those who actually don't want to engage in the discussion. Monosyllabic answers.
Short answers.
Don't take you anywhere.
Any maverick that you've interviewed who can completely put you off guard on your next line of questioning?
I suppose it was the man who was famous, and I've forgotten his name now, forgive me, for saying, diamond, diamond, don't destroy him. Remember, he was a junior minister in Rajiv Gandhi.
Kalpanath Rai.
Kalpanath Rai. He was impossible to interview because he slid like butter all over the place, and he never said very much. And so there was nothing to grasp, because as soon as you grasp it, it's...
So he was into slogans and you were into questioning?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But who's been amongst the more boring guests that you've interviewed? It's difficult to extract anything out of them.
That is a question that I won't answer, because I think it will upset people to know that
And you want to continue to have them as guests?
I take great pride in the fact that there hasn't as yet been a guest who's refused to give me a second interview. Mr. Modi, I haven't approached for a second interview, but I'm confident that when I do, he'll say yes to. And that's something I cherish.
Ever thought in terms of training yourself to become bilingual, because a large number of Indian guests may not be able to match up to your language?
Oh, I've often dreamt of that, but I know that my incapacity to learn a language at this age means that I will never succeed. And I'll tell you a little story. When I first had to ask someone a couple of questions in Hindi, just after I'd come back from England, I learnt them by heart. And I then said those 3 questions, and after the first, the guy looked at me and said, Maaf karega, hum Angrezi nahi bolte.
I see. One last question before I go on to yet another connected subject. That angry expression on your face, your teeth are clenched and you put it to your eyes, you are staring at the guest. Now, is it a put-on act in order to intimidate the guest, or is it a question that you want your guest also to react and give you a fine answer?
No, it's something even worse. It's just the way I am. I can't help it. I'm not aware I'm doing it. And you know, it leads to a lot of humor at home. My mother, who's 92 nearly, when I'm chatting to her at home, she suddenly says to me, first of all, she says, don't keep questioning me. You're not interviewing me. And I said, oh, come on, mommy, I'm only asking you for an answer to a question. And then she says, all right, here's the answer. And she does, to me. So, you know, it's a great joke with the family.
Well, in any case, we'll have a small break, Karan, and we'll come back on questions other than the ones on Karan Thapa's style of interviewing. Well, welcome back for the Devil's Advocate, and my guest with you today is Karan Thapa. Well, Karan, let's set aside how and why you have this aggressive posturing, at least the image of a very aggressive interviewer. I come over to somewhat a connected issue. Yours is still one of the most serious political discussion programs on Indian television. Are you now, as an experienced political commentator and an anchor, really concerned about the present state of political television on the news media?
If you're suggesting that political discourse on television is becoming shallow, populist rather than popular, and therefore it's aiming to catch eyeballs at the cost of rigorous analysis and informed discussion, I would agree with you. And I think it's particularly sad. And I think the root cause lies in the fact that independent television in India is commercially driven. It survives on advertising. Advertising comes for the highest eyeballs, which means ratings become important. In contrast, if you look at something
But
like...
survive to do what? That's my question.
Well, actually...
5 years ago, if a television carried a program which was somewhat critical of me or my party, I'll be deeply concerned. Today, its credibility is going down to such an extent. A, there are a large number of televisions, so each individual channel doesn't matter. B, what really matters in the news content of a large number of channels is cinema, cricket, crime, occasionally some crisis, and even in that crisis, it will be some shallow tangential news which will be passed off as a breaking news. And therefore, the credibility of that news, even with that survived or the commercially driven channel, is not very high.
Except that you're talking about credibility amongst different sections of society. The credibility, because of the reasons you mentioned with you and me, may have diminished very much. But the credibility with the mass audience, for the very same reasons, may have increased. They like cricket, they like crisis, they like cinema, they like the stars, and they probably watch a lot more.
They're watching entertainment.
Or infotainment.
They're watching gossip.
Else. Precisely. Well, gossip may be putting it too strongly, but they're watching a lighter form and shade of news to the type that you and I would prefer. And that I can accept. But that means that the credibility is actually low for you and me, but huge for them.
Are we rushing to instant conclusions because they make attractive headlines? I think politicians went in conventionally for this kind of a populism, but is the media going in for it?
Or are we doing it because it's lazy journalism? And it may be a combination of both.
How would you, I'll just give you 2 or 3 illustrations which have deeply disturbed me. 5 or 6 months ago, we had a serious situation in Jammu and Kashmir, a province that matters a lot to India. Now, you had the land row at the Amarnath Shrine Board, you had a reaction in the valley, and you had an agitation and a counter-agitation. You had serious journalists now commenting that time has come that we must think and seriously say if Kashmir goes, it goes. 5 or 6 months later, you are having an election which is perceived to be a fair election. How do you explain what was being written by serious political commentators just 6 months ago?
But it was their opinion. Why do you want to attach more importance than you would to anyone else's opinion? It's an opinion you disagreed with, but it was an opinion at that point of time that reflected a certain mood and that forced others to think.
Fringe media can be subversive in thought.
But it wasn't subversive.
But to say that you give up a part of Indian territory, it's certainly not a very nationalistic...
It was going a little deeper than that. You're simplifying it. It was saying that if they don't want to stay Indian, then let them go.
All right, come recently. You had campaigns I have seen over the last few years. how strong anti-terror steps are against a particular community. And suddenly after the bombing incident of 26/11, the same set of serious channels on electronic media now started deflecting the real issue, how to tackle this situation, by saying, and campaigns were carried, enough is enough, all politicians are horrible. An anti-politician sentiment in the country was being whipped up, whereas the issue was, how does India tackle terror? Now, is that a serious approach to journalism which mainstream media can have?
You see, what you've identified is a lack of consistency in the editorial line of a particular channel or a particular paper, and you're correct in spotting that 26/11 represented not just a break, but a complete U-turn and reversal of the position they had taken previously. And you're arguing that this is a little convenient and perhaps expeditious of them. And you're absolutely right. But reality does allow for people to change their positions. And maybe you should look at it and say that if a channel is good enough and honest enough to say that they regard 26/11 as a new reality and therefore they will U-turn their view, be happy with it.
I can quite understand media informing, media educating, media holding a mirror to the society and also to individual politicians. But media doing this kind of a U-turn then certainly takes away the credibility of what is one of the strongest limbs of Indian democracy.
Which is one of the great dangers of inconsistency, which is one of the great dangers when a channel or a newspaper suddenly decides that a seminal event is going to lead them to change their views. If you're going to change your views, what you need to do, I think, is to publicly admit
or
to
take
the fact,
latest.
or no, publicly admit to the fact, like newspapers do, have a long editorial and explain why you're doing it, and explain it in great length, and share with the viewer the agony that you've gone through in the process.
Take for instance, even when headlines are fixed on electronic media, till 25/11, the Malegaon incident, day after day, for 20 days was Hindu terror. And 26/11, the slogan now was, terrorism has no religion.
But Hindu terror was no different as a short form to the previous short form that was fashionable, Islamic terror. It was a way of branding and explaining a type of terror, but it was misleading, I grant it, but it was done.
Coming to another point, you've interviewed a large number of Pakistani politicians and representatives. And watching you interviewing them and your own views in your column and otherwise, I've got a distinct impression that you've always stood for making the borders irrelevant and a greater cooperation between the two countries. How do you, as a political commentator, post 26/11, see the situation today?
Well, personally, I'm deeply depressed by the development. I think that Pakistan needs to do a lot more before we can even begin to believe that they've accepted their culpability. But at the same time, I also think that we need to understand the difficulties they have, that with Zardari, they're moving in a particular direction, but he's opposed by the army. Understanding from us, plus a certain measure of support for the civilian element as opposed to the military element, will help that stabilization and that acceptance in Pakistan.
But it's not merely, the concern is not merely the Pakistani army or the ISI doing what they are or these fringe groups doing what they are. The mainstream media has convinced the population that all this is humbug Indian propaganda.
Unfortunately, I think the media on both sides have convinced their respective populations of extreme views, and I think the argument that you make about the Pakistani media, they could make equally effectively about the Indian media.
I would say, in all fairness, Indian media may take contrary positions in these issues, but Indian media has never touted this kind of falsehood.
No, grant them credit for the fact that Dawn News actually went and identified Kasab's parents. They established his identity card numbers. They actually got the father to have a look at the picture and accept that this was his son. Now, that's a very important and actually
and that is mainstream Pakistani,
stuff.
and that Dawn is
mainstream.
But you have a situation where Pakistan may be a geographical entity, but you have a democratic government in Pakistan which is not in control. You have an army which is not accountable.
And you have militancy and jihad that is spreading. And the greatest fear would be if you end up with the Taliban as your next door neighbor. And therefore you have to ask yourself, whatever you do mustn't end up with that nightmare becoming your reality.
And therefore we come back to a difficult question from what you say in. The borders are still very relevant. And that whole idealistic thought, which a lot of bleeding hearts had in India, let's make the borders irrelevant, is something which is not foreseeable today.
Irrelevant borders don't mean non-existent borders. Right? Irrelevant borders mean friendly borders. Irrelevant borders mean secure and safe borders where you can trust the people.
Is there an environment for the countries to be friendly when you have such a hostile situation?
Not today, but you need to work towards it. The ideal is something you strive towards. It isn't given and achieved today. safe borders, open borders, that's a long-term target. It's not something you're going to settle on in 24 hours' time. At the moment today, you have the opposite.
Well, your interviews with Shahid Malik, the Pakistani High Commissioner, and then earlier with President Zardari, were very civilized interviews. In fact, you were more polite to them than you were to your Indian guests. Was it the Indian hospitality?
No, I think it wasn't Indian hospitality. In the case of President Zardari, who is at the other end of a satellite, it's almost impossible to interrupt someone at the other end of a satellite. In the case of Shahid Malik, I could have been extremely aggressive, but would I have achieved the relative openness and candor in replies that I got?
Well, all I can tell you, Karan, is that we, the Indian politicians, are also looking for such very civil interviews from Karan Thapar so that we can...
But Arun, the best interviews is when I quarrel with you and you fight back with me. Both you and I enjoy it. That makes for the fun and the drama. And the nice thing is that you know and I know that we're actually playing a game with each other. Isn't that what a good interview is?
Well, thank you very much, Karan. I'll think be at your best, as you always are.
Thank you. Thank you, Arun.